The tape was never meant to be released, and yet once you hear her say it, the entire story changes. For decades, Nancy Kulp lived inside a carefully constructed image. To millions, she was the polite, proper, slightly awkward Miss Jane Hathaway, the loyal secretary from the Beverly Hillbillies. The character felt safe, predictable, almost timeless. But the woman behind that role was never as simple as television made her seem. Near the end of her life, during one of her final recorded interviews, Kulp spoke more freely than she ever had before. There was no studio audience, no co-stars laughing between takes, no producers guiding the conversation. Just a quiet room, a microphone, and someone finally asking the questions she had spent years avoiding. At first, she talked about her career the way actors usually do, fond memories, funny, set stories, gratitude toward fans. But as the conversation continued, the tone shifted. Her answers slowed, long pauses appeared. She began choosing her words with unusual care, as if she understood the recording might outlive her. Because she did. Nancy Kulp had always been described as private. Not mysterious, just reserved. Yet Hollywood has a way of punishing anyone who refuses to play along, especially in the era she came from. During the 1960s and 70s, public image was not optional, it was survival. Actors signed contracts not only about work, but about who they were allowed to be. Kulp fit a role executives loved, intelligent, respectable, and non-threatening. She wasn't cast as the glamorous star or the romantic lead, she was dependable. That made her valuable, but it also trapped her. Studios built careers around personas, and once audiences accepted you in a certain shape, stepping outside it became dangerous. In the interview, she admitted she knew exactly how she was being marketed. She even described meetings where network representatives explained how important it was that viewers felt comfortable with her. The phrase came up more than once, comfortable, familiar, reassuring. Then she laughed softly, but not happily. She said something that surprised even the interviewer, that the character audiences adored was partly designed to prevent them from asking questions about her real life. The industry, she explained, didn't just sell shows, it sold certainty. And uncertainty about a performer could cost sponsors, ratings, and reputations. For years, rumors had circulated quietly among fans and insiders alike. Nothing loud enough to become scandal, but persistent enough to never disappear. Kulp never publicly addressed them, not in interviews, not in appearances, not even when directly prompted in earlier years. She would redirect the conversation back to acting, education, or politics, subjects she openly cared about. But now she didn't redirect. Instead, she acknowledged that silence had been part of an understanding, not a written contract, something more subtle. She suggested that many performers of her generation lived within similar arrangements, lives edited for public consumption, truths managed carefully, so the illusion could remain intact. She explained that, for most of her life, honesty had consequences she could not afford. In the early years of television, actors didn't simply protect their careers, they protected entire productions. A single rumor could threaten syndication deals, sponsor contracts, and the livelihoods of hundreds of crew members. Kulp said performers understood this without needing it stated directly. The rules existed in conversations that never appeared on paper. She described arriving in Hollywood with a background very different from the typical aspiring actress. Before acting, she worked in journalism and even served in military intelligence during World War II. She was educated, analytical and observant, which meant she recognized quickly how the system operated. Fame, she said, wasn't about talent alone. It was about predictability, and predictability required editing. On set, the Beverly Hillbillies became a hit. Everything changed. Her face became instantly recognizable. Strangers believed they knew her personality. Viewers wrote letters addressed not to Nancy, but to Miss Hathaway, asking advice as if she truly worked for the Clampett family. That blurring of reality created opportunity, but also restriction. She admitted the studio encouraged the confusion. Executives preferred audiences to feel characters continued existing after the episode ended. For some actors that meant public appearances in costume. For others, it meant never contradicting the image on screen. Kulp fell into the second category. Her intelligence and polite demeanor made the illusion easy to maintain, and increasingly difficult to escape. During the interview, she recounted moments when reporters tried to steer conversations toward her personal life. She had learned a technique: answer thoroughly, but reveal nothing, talk about books, civic work, education, travel, offer sincerity without exposure. The press often left satisfied, believing they had conducted a meaningful interview, while the essential questions remained untouched. She emphasized she was never directly threatened. No one said, "You must hide this." Instead, opportunities quietly aligned with compliance. Roles continued coming. Invitations arrived. Stability depended on cooperation. Those who resisted often found auditions disappearing. Then she described watching other actors struggle after stepping outside acceptable boundaries. Careers stalled. Public opinion shifted quickly. She realized the safest choice was silence, not only for herself, but for the people relying on the show's success. Her voice in the recording became softer at this point, almost reflective. She said she didn't resent the audience. In fact, she believed viewers deserved the comfort television provided. During turbulent decades, political unrest, war, social change, programs like the Beverly Hillbillies offered simplicity. She felt responsibility to preserve that feeling, even if it meant setting parts of her identity aside. But she also acknowledged the cost. Living two parallel lives required constant awareness. Casual comments had to be filtered. Friendships navigated carefully. Public events rehearsed mentally beforehand. She called it performing without a script, a role lasting far longer than any television season. The interviewer asked whether she ever considered breaking the illusion earlier. She said yes many times. Yet each time she concluded the truth would become spectacle rather than understanding. The era, she believed, was not ready to listen without judgment. So she waited, assuming eventually time itself would make the conversation easier. She said the strangest part was realizing the audience had grown older alongside her. The people who once watched the show as children were now adults, living in a different cultural climate than the one she entered decades earlier. Society discussed subjects openly that had once been whispered about behind closed doors. What had been career-ending in the 1960s had become, at the very least, understandable by the time of the interview. That shift mattered to her. Kulp explained she never believed the truth itself was scandalous, only the reaction to it. In her early career years, personal details about actors were treated as moral judgments rather than simple facts. The public often didn't separate performer from character. If Miss Hathaway represented decency, then the actress had to embody a specific, narrow definition of it. Anything outside that boundary risked breaking the illusion viewers relied upon. She paused again and mentioned letters she received during the show's run. Most were kind. Some were intensely personal, written by people who saw her character as trustworthy. She worried that revealing too much about herself back then would have felt like betraying their expectations, not because she owed them deception, but because the industry had trained audiences to believe television personalities were extensions of fiction. Over time, she began to understand the burden wasn't hers alone. Nearly every performer from that era carried some version of it. Some hid relationships, others hid beliefs. Some even hid their own ambitions because it conflicted with the image studios preferred. She described Hollywood then as a place where silence functioned as a professional skill. The interviewer asked whether she regretted staying quiet for so long. Her answer was complicated. She said she regretted the necessity, not the decision. Given the circumstances of the period, she believed speaking openly would have ended her career quickly and overshadowed her work entirely. Instead of being remembered for her performances, she would have been reduced to headlines. That, she felt, would have taken something away from audiences who simply wanted entertainment. Yet she admitted the separation between public and private identity gradually became exhausting. Even after the show ended, habits remained. When recognition follows you for decades, people continue expecting familiarity. They approach you as someone they've known their whole lives while you meet them for the first time. Correcting their assumptions felt disruptive, so she rarely tried. In the recording, her tone grew warmer when discussing later years. Teaching, public speaking, and community involvement gave her spaces where she could be more authentic without the weight of national television expectations. There, she noticed something reassuring. When people encountered her directly rather than through a character, they accepted complexity more easily than she once feared. That realization slowly changed her perspective. Perhaps the audience had always been capable of understanding. Perhaps the restrictions were more about the industry's anxiety than the public's intolerance. She couldn't prove it, but the possibility lingered with her. Toward the end of this portion, she admitted the interview itself felt like closing a long chapter, not a revelation intended to shock anyone, but a correction to the simplified version of her life that had circulated for decades. She then addressed the question people had circled around for years, but rarely asked directly. The interviewer chose careful wording, almost hesitant, as if aware the moment carried weight beyond ordinary conversation. Kulp listened without interrupting. When the question finished, she didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough to feel deliberate rather than uncertain. Finally, she acknowledged that much of her personal life had been intentionally kept undefined in the public eye. Not falsely presented, simply left incomplete. She explained there were friendships and relationships she valued deeply, but never described publicly because any label would have drawn attention away from her work and toward speculation. In her era, the conversation would not have centered on understanding, it would have centered on controversy. The nuance of a human life would have been reduced to a headline. She made clear she never lived in fear of who she was. The concern was the reaction surrounding it. Studios invested heavily in predictability. Once an actor became associated with debate, networks worried affiliates might refuse broadcasts in certain regions. Sponsors could withdraw advertising. Entire productions could suffer over matters unrelated to performance. So privacy became practicality. Kulp emphasized she didn't feel forced by a single person or threat. Instead, she described a shared awareness. Everyone understood which topics complicated business. Choosing silence wasn't surrender. It was participation in an unspoken agreement that allowed the show and the people employed by it to continue. The interviewer asked if maintaining that separation ever caused resentment. She answered no, but admitted it caused distance. Fans believed they knew her intimately because they invited her into their homes every week. Meanwhile, she knew almost nothing about them. Offering personal truths in that environment, she felt would have transformed a professional relationship into a public negotiation over her identity. She preferred her work to remain the focus. Yet, with decades past, and many of those industry pressures gone, she said the meaning of privacy had changed. People now spoke openly about aspects of themselves that once remained hidden. Hearing younger performers discuss their lives freely gave her a sense of relief, not jealousy, but satisfaction that they wouldn't need the same careful boundaries. Then came the statement that redefined the interview. She confirmed the long-standing assumptions about her personal orientation were not misunderstandings. She didn't frame it dramatically. She didn't name dates or provide details. She simply affirmed that the life she lived privately aligned with what many had quietly believed. Her voice remained steady. She added that, at the time of her career peak, disclosure would have overshadowed everything she worked for. Instead of discussing scripts, performances, or the evolution of television, conversations would have narrowed into a single topic. She wanted to be remembered for her contributions, not categorized by one aspect of identity. She leaned back slightly, and for the first time in the recording, her voice carried unmistakable ease. Not the careful professionalism she maintained for decades, something lighter, as if removing the effort of omission mattered more than the information itself. She explained she never viewed the truth as a secret she was ashamed of, but rather a detail that never belonged to the business side of entertainment during her most active years. Actors of her generation, she said, were often treated less like individuals and more like symbols. Each represented stability, humor, romance, or propriety, depending on their casting. Once assigned, those qualities had to remain intact in the public imagination. Changing them risked disrupting not only careers but the emotional connection audiences built with weekly programming. Kulp believed her character worked precisely because viewers trusted her. Miss Hathaway was sensible in a world of chaos, the voice of reason among exaggerated personalities. If audiences began analyzing the actress instead of the character, the spell might weaken. At the time, preserving the story felt more important than correcting assumptions about herself. She reflected on how television had evolved since then. Later generations of performers were allowed complexity. Viewers learned to separate role from reality. The industry slowly discovered authenticity didn't destroy attachment, it often strengthened it. Watching that change convinced her that speaking honestly now would be received as context rather than disruption. Importantly, she didn't present the revelation as bravery. She rejected that description outright in the interview. To her, courage belonged to people who lived openly when consequences were immediate and severe. Her situation, late in life and long after her primary career, carried far less risk. What she offered was perspective. She hoped audiences would understand the difference between deception and discretion. The character they enjoyed was never false. The laughter was real. What remained private simply existed outside the frame of what television in that era could comfortably hold. Near the closing minutes, the interviewer asked how she wanted to be remembered. Her response was direct. As someone who did her job well and treated people kindly, nothing more elaborate. She didn't want the late clarification to redefine her career or overshadow years of work. Instead, she wanted it to remove speculation so the conversation could finally return to the craft itself. The recording ended quietly, no dramatic final line, no emotional farewell. Just a thank you exchanged between two people who understood they had preserved something important. Not a scandal, but completeness. And in that calm ending lay the real significance of the interview. For decades, audiences sensed there was more to Nancy Kulp than the narrow portrait television provided. Not because she hid a life, but because she lived in a time that required careful editing of it. Her final words didn't overturn her legacy.